All right. Thank you so much all for coming. My name is Jane Nesbit, and I am the education coordinator here at the Institute for Holocaust Education. And I'm going to be talking about bringing the individual voices of the Holocaust to the forefront of Holocaust education. I'm going to be drawing works from works such as Salvaged Pages, Young Writers Diaries of the Holocaust, The Diary of Anne Frank, and others to showcase their individual stories during the Holocaust and the lessons that we can learn from them. I will be also focusing on how these individual stories can be used in the classroom to inspire a community to use empathy and understanding in a time of rising anti-Semitism. So thank you again for coming, and I am just going to share my screen. All right, I believe you can all see my screen, so I'm going to get started. So again, thank you so much for being here today. This presentation is on the individual voices of the Holocaust. Throughout this presentation, you will see examples of diaries that survived, as in the case of Anne Frank's diary on your left. Diaries bear witness to some of the most heartbreaking experiences of the Holocaust. They are a, quote, real-time record of an individual's life. They also document the fear, loss, trauma, and sometimes even the hope felt by human beings facing extreme peril. Today, historians, teachers, and their students study diaries and personal letters from the 1930s and 40s to better understand how ordinary people experienced the Holocaust and World War II. These writers documented their experiences, confided their feelings, and reflected on the trauma they endured during these nightmare years. Very few of the millions of children persecuted during the Holocaust wrote diaries and journals that have survived. Each diary reflects a fragment of its author's life. Taken together, the diaries provide readers with a varied and complex view of the people who lived and died during the Holocaust, as seen in Peter's diary, which was written and addressed to his parents, who he never saw again. Young journal writers of this period came from all walks of life. Some children diarists came from poor or peasant families. Others were born to middle-class professionals. Some grew up in wealth and privilege. A handful came from deeply religious families, while others grew up in an assimilated and secular community. A majority of children diarists, however, identified with Jewish traditions and cultures, regardless of their degree of personal faith, as in the case of Renina and her diary that she started at age 15, January 31st, 1939, where she documents her experience of being Jewish in Poland just months before the start of World War II. For many, diaries are more than paper on which to collect thoughts. Some people give their diaries a name, making a special confidant. To read somebody's diary is to enter what is often a very private world. In recording the events of their lives, diarists explore their own relationship with the world around them. Child diarists and journals from the Holocaust era can be grouped into three broad categories. Those written by children who escaped German-controlled territories and became refugees are partisans. Those written by children living in hiding, and those maintained by young people as ghetto residents, as persons living under other restrictions imposed by German authorities, or more rarely as concentration camp prisoners. A careful study of this history is needed for students as they explore the connection between scapegoating and peer groups and the eventual descent into genocide. They recognize that bigotry and intolerance make democracies vulnerable and turn neighbor against neighbor. They learn that civil liberties must be protected and that actions of individuals matter. These diaries are not neutral historical and literary documents. They call for a moral response. They call for empathy, outrage, and action. Reading such different firsthand accounts reminds us that each of the Holocaust's millions of victims had a unique and dramatic experience. At a time when the Holocaust has receded so far into the past that even the youngest survivors are elderly, it's especially powerful to discover a youthful voice describing the events in real time. Sherry Turkle, a professor at MIT, also notes that diary authors pause, they hesitate, they backtrack, they don't know what they think. And for readers, this prolonged engagement in another person's thinking produces empathy. The sheer number of Holocaust victims is difficult to comprehend. Emphasis on diverse personal experiences, such as that of Anne Frank, helps portray the victims as individuals instead of part of a larger number. Diaries written during the Holocaust give voices to the victims, voices that would otherwise have been lost, as in the case of Anne Frank and her voice. She wrote about her feelings and thoughts while hiding in the secret annex. She was inspired to rewrite her diary after hearing from the Dutch Minister of Education. And had Meekgees not gone back to the secret annex after her arrest, Anne's voice and diary could have been lost. What inspired Anne Frank to rewrite her diary was in part this quote: "History cannot be written on the basis of official decisions and documents alone. If our descendants are to understand fully what we as a nation have had to endure and overcome during these years, then what we really need are ordinary documents, a diary, a letter." These diaries, however, are a fragment and offer a brief glimpse into the era of the Holocaust, which reflects many personal backgrounds and wartime circumstances. Their authors often address themes such as the nature of human suffering, the moral and ethical dimensions of persecution, and the struggle of hope against despair. Each diary reflects a fragment of its author's life, but taken together, the diaries provides readers with a varied and complex view of young people who lived and died during the Holocaust. Excuse me. Sorry, I skipped a slide. This concept that diaries are a fragment of life is remarked by Alexandra Zapruder, editor of Salvaged Pages, in a podcast through the United States Holocaust Museum, in which she states, "You know, Anne Frank's diary was the first diary that was published, and her voice was so powerful that it captured the voices of all the children and all the people who had been killed. And that's the way it was framed. And that by reading her diary and sort of taking her into our hearts, we could redeem her life." And it never rung true to me. And I had these diaries, I had this cache in a way of primary sources, each of which kept saying to me, that's not what we're about. You know, we're not about the triumph of human spirit. We're about something else, which is as simple as a mark in the world. If a life is gone and what's left are 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 pages, that's not a life. that's a fragment of life. One such fragmented example in Salvaged Pages is of Elizabeth, who began her diary just before her 16th birthday while she was an Austrian refugee in France. Alexandra also notes that these diaries then are broken and unfinished fragments from the Holocaust, not imbued with special gifts overlaid with precious attributes or assigned a sacred role. They belong to the vast body of historical fragments that testify to our collective past. And like the fragment of an ancient pot that we may turn over in our hands to admire for its beauty, to examine for it its clues as to the past, and to ponder for its suggestion of the passage of time and an era, these diaries are replete with their own information and potency, each reflecting specific circumstances and each with its own measure of fact, truth, or insight. These diaries nevertheless make their contribution to an understanding of the history of the Holocaust. The history we learn in school proceeds with linear logic. Each chain of event seems obvious and inexorable. Reading the diary of a person muddling through history is jarringly different, more like the confusing experience of actually living it. In real time, people are slow to recognize events taking place around them because they have other priorities, because these events happen invisibly, because changes are incremental and people keep on recalibrating. With all of this being said, why should teachers use diaries in their classroom? Teachers can use the voices of these young writers as a springboard for discussion and for reflection on the value of these diaries as historical sources and literary records. It also provides an avenue for discussing the power of our words to make a difference in the world. Teachers can also use these diaries to show the many ways that Jewish people resisted, both in action and through written word. These diaries also provide insight into Jewish life prior to World War II and the Holocaust, thus giving context to all that was lost during these tragic events. Some essential questions that teachers can ask their students are, how do I express myself? What experiences in my life have shaped my perspective and voice? What compelled these young people to write in diaries during the Holocaust? How did the Holocaust change the norm of making choices? What do we learn from these diaries about the moral dilemmas people faced during the Holocaust? And how does this knowledge influence the way we think about our choices today? Up until this point, I've been talking about diaries. However, there are other ways that teachers can bring the individual voices of the Holocaust into their classroom, and that is through recorded testimony. Some suggested resources that teachers can use to bring testimony into their classroom are Facing History and Ourselves, Yad Vashem, Echoes and Reflections, the Institute for Holocaust Education, the Shoah Foundation and Eyewitness, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and many others. In conclusion, there are questions that need to be asked about Holocaust education. What is the purpose of Holocaust education in today's high schools? Can it help prepare students to challenge hate and prejudice when they see it? These questions were asked by Echoes and Reflections U.S. College Survey, and the results indicate the positive outcomes of Holocaust education not only reflects gains in historical knowledge, but also manifests in cultivating more empathetic, tolerant, and engaged students. These feelings are shared by students, especially when reading diaries like Hava's, whose final entry in her diary reads that her brother hadn't come back. Students with Holocaust education also report in having greater knowledge about the Holocaust than their peers and understanding its values, having a more pluralistic attitudes and are more open to differing viewpoints. They report greater willingness to challenge intolerant behavior and show higher critical thinking skills and a greater sense of social responsibility and civic efficacy if they watch survivor testimony as part of their experience. I want to end with a quote by Elie Wiesel. I believe firmly and profoundly that whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. So those who hear us, those who lead us, must continue to bear witness for us. Up until now, they're doing it with us. At a certain point in time, they will do it for us all. Thank you so much. And now I just want to open for discussion and for any questions that you might have. Yes, thank you, Steve.
This is the book that you're referring.
Yes, I am. Yes, I have my copy as well. Yes. Oh, you can't see it because of the blur.
Were there perhaps one or two diaries that stood out to you for any particular reason? And if so, could you amplify about the authors, what they described, and perhaps the message they conveyed?
Absolutely. I want to actually refer back to the last diary that I just mentioned, Hava's diary, which in the Salvaged Pages is referenced with her brother, Petra, and she was originally called, her original name was Eva. And she notes that she also writes a diary during this time. And after she is liberated, she writes that she's waiting for her brother. And she waits. And then she writes one final note where she says that her brother didn't come back. And it's just so incredibly moving and powerful to note, to read what she is experiencing and to be able to develop sense of empathy and understanding to those traumatic experiences that she lived through.
Which one was that, Jane?
In the book, let me just pull it out for you. That is going to be on page 160.
160?
Yes, sir.
And what
It
happened?
is about
What
her
happened
brother.
What happened to the brother?
He did not survive. He was killed.
Do we know where?
Yes, he was killed in Auschwitz.
Okay.
Does anybody have any other questions? Any comments? Oh, Scott may mention of, does anybody have any comments on the use of holograms to use as narratives? So that's something that we're seeing now, where people are recording survivors and their testimony, which then people can ask questions to these recordings. Yes. Let me unmute you. If you could just unmute yourself. All right. While you're unmuting yourself, Steve also made mention that he interacted with a hologram in the LA Holocaust Museum, and it did have some limitations.
So my question is, how did these diaries surface?
So that's a really great question. So in part, one of the books that I kept referencing back was Salvaged Pages by Alexandra Zapruder, and her research was on finding these diaries and then collecting them and editing them into this book. And there are several diaries within. There are many more. The unfortunate piece is that there were many more diaries written, but many of those diaries were lost or destroyed or not found yet. And so she was able to find and, in this case, translate them into English.
So I must have missed what you said because I just got a phone call. But so where did they find them? I'm assuming they were hidden somewhere.
Yes, so it depends on the diary itself. Some diaries were found on the side of the road. Some diaries were left in possession of other people that were then found after. It really depends case by case on each diary.
Well, it's wonderful that they found them and they translated them and they put them in a book.
Yes, absolutely. Does anybody have any other questions? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment. The narratives that were taken from Holocaust survivors at the United States Holocaust Museum, they run about an hour and a half. They're really very, intense and complete.
Yes. Yes, they are. All right. Well, if anybody has any other questions or comments, very much welcome them. But again, thank you so much for coming here today and hearing a little bit more about these individual voices of the Holocaust through their diaries. Thank you so much. All right, take care.